So I run a project called City Atlas, and we designed this game about the future of New York that we're going to show you a little bit of. First, I wanted to give you some background on how our project got started. So we started in 2011. We were partnered with the Institute for Sustainable Cities at Hunter College, where there's the co-founder of the city's climate panel was also the founder of the Institute for Sustainable Cities. First, I thought I'd bring into sharp focus the urgency about climate. This is just a recent tweet from David Wallace Wells, who writes about it at New York Magazine. So during the pandemic, emissions dropped, but actually the rate we need to drop emissions is so steep at this point that it actually has to go faster than everything that happened when our economies shut down. And this slide shows you a report from C40.org, which is a consortium of cities. And New York is a signatory to this group, which is funded by actually Bloomberg. And New York's commitment is the dashed line, the steepest slope. And this graph starts in 2015, so we're supposed to be heading down already. So if you look at the period between 2020 and 2030, you can see how radical the change is in the carbon emissions that we're slated to reduce. Our carbon emissions are really embedded in our society. I mean, the way we use energy is what produces carbon emissions. And to change the system at the rate that we're showing on this graph basically means changing everything we do. So that's the report. So one of the things that's happening is on the bureaucratic level, all of this information is well understood, you know, on the governmental level and really at the high-end business level. So a lot of things are coming up onto the table, one of them being this seawall idea to protect New York from storm surges. And the reason I point this one out is because one way or another, the future economy is really going to be driven by climate. So we're either building giant seawalls or we're changing the energy system at an incredible rate, or both. You know, I don't necessarily think the seawall is going to happen, but I wanted to focus on the scale here too, to get to Dr. Zabel's point. $119 billion, if you just set aside 1% of that, you'd have over $1 billion to educate people, and that might be a good investment. So we started with the intention of providing a public-facing explanation for these kinds of climate projections. And actually, New York City has these. We have our own climate panel, which is mostly IPCC authors. They're people who also work on the UN climate panel. And the reports get delivered to the mayor's office. They get covered in the press, but they kind of go in one ear and out the other. So we've been watching that process for 10 years now. When we started, we really focused the project on how New York could be a low carbon city in the sense of how it can be rewarding to live a sustainable lifestyle. And New York, because it's a dense city and it has mass transit, actually has the lowest per capita footprint on average of really anywhere in the US, because everywhere else you really need to drive. And there's a ton of things to do. There's mass transit. So this is how the site was designed, you know, 4 or 5, you know, up until about 3 years ago. And we interviewed really who's who of leaders in New York, including climate scientists like Gavin Schmidt, and these you know, types of people that come from art, from architecture, activists, Eddie Bautista, for instance, of the New York's Environmental Justice Coalition. I would say about 5 years ago, we were working intensely on sea level. And it was really working on sea level that began to get us to focus more concretely on the steps the city needs to take. Because New York is like any coastal city, it's vulnerable. It's really facing an existential challenge with sea level, which is more or less now an inevitable process. The high estimates go above 6 feet by 2100. So once we started really focusing on that, in this interview in particular with James White, who's one of the US's leading glaciologists, is an example, we started to think about what it would actually take to run New York on renewable energy. How you would build it, how much it would take to build, where it would go. You make everything electric, and you generate the electricity without producing CO2. So there's a few things that you discover when you're figuring out how to run the city on renewable energy. One of them is that the things you see often shown, like wind turbines, are really about half the picture. The other half is the storage that you need for when the wind isn't blowing. And nobody was really explaining that. So that's the board Cecil designed. And you have to build 16 gigawatts of renewable or carbon-free energy to power the city. One thing you notice immediately is that the power is mostly coming from outside the city because there isn't enough room in the city, which makes it a political question also. And so we had 5 early versions. We had 5 of the first prototype, and it got onto Twitter and people started ordering it. So universities started to try it out, but we also had high school students in New York play it. And the advantage of a game in terms of understanding this is you have to make decisions while you play. And then you have to deal with the consequences of those decisions. Had some feedback on the game. Grist wrote us up in the last couple months. This is from yesterday or the day before yesterday, where they collected a bunch of games they liked. And this is their description of our game. And these were students at The Point, which is an after-school program. They were really among the first groups that came down to our office and tried the game out with us. And then Carnegie Mellon bought 11 sets for a class on energy for developing countries, where they wanted to use the game as a way to map out the same questions. So we're really facing a crash program. I think you get that from the other speakers. But it's really like 5 crash programs. The game is showing you just the energy system, but every building in New York has to change. It's like a wartime effort. And so if people don't understand why it needs to happen and the types of choices that there are, it's going to be really hard, even for well-meaning politicians, to do what they need to do. Now I'm going to turn it over to Archie and Theo to talk about the game more specifically.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining us, and thanks for introducing that, Richard. So I'm going to share my screen as well, and quickly talk about how the game works a little bit, and then Theo is going to talk about how the game can be used as a teaching tool. So like Richard mentioned, Energetic is really a game about the future of New York City. So at a very basic level, the game works by asking a team of 4 to 6 players to work together to build a new zero carbon energy system for New York City. according to Paris Agreement timelines, and then recently it's been shown to kind of match up with the timelines of the CLCPA, like what Tina brought up earlier too. And the idea of the game kind of generally is to provide a thorough, kind of comprehensive look at the scale, the shape, and the urgency of this transition, and to kind of concretely show everything you need to know about the energy transition all in one box. So I'm just going to walk through a few of the components of the game rather than trying to kind of explain exactly how it works. Just kind of highlight some of the components that make it a really great teaching tool, and then I'm going to walk through how one turn of the game works so you get at least a small idea about the dynamics. So like I mentioned, it's a collaborative game, but there are distinct roles that each player inhabits, and these all work together. They all have different abilities and different kind of constraints. So the 4 playing roles are the activist, the politician, the entrepreneur, and the engineer. We recently added 2 special roles, the regulator, who kind of tracks and monitors the game, and then a journalist who can tell the story of the game. Because like Richard was talking about, really what the game is doing is creating a narrative for the next several decades about how New York can complete this huge project of this energy transition. So here is the board of the game, and you can kind of see the 4 roles all sit around the board and you all work together. So I'll quickly just walk through kind of the components of the board. Like you can see, the board is a map. It's slightly distorted, but it's basically a map of New York State. Like Richard mentioned, these are city-sized pieces of infrastructure that you're building in the game. To power New York City, you need to build in the rest of New York State. And so a large part of the game is kind of maintaining those community relationships. And that's kind of an indicator of the social and political constraints of the game, in addition to the technological constraints. So at the top of the board, you'll see the Gigawatt Tracker. Your goal is to get all the way from 0 gigawatts to 16 gigawatts. You're on a timeline, which is at the bottom. So in the high ambition version, you're trying to complete your 16 gigawatts by 2035. Along the way, you are constantly monitoring your grid stability scale, which is the orange scale on the left side of the board, and is basically a measure of whether you're keeping the lights on as you're making this transition. The grid stability is lowered by variable sources like wind, and then raised, like Richard was mentioning, by building out this storage system. Finally, on the right side of the board is the public opinion scale, which is another big constraint and determines your odds in an election. So I'm just gonna walk through all the different types of cards. These are your build cards, which introduce players to the tools, the technological tools that will complete this energy transition. There's also research cards, which are blue, to unlock new types of technology. You can pass policies with these gray policy cards, conduct community campaigns or raise money. And finally, here is the unit of money in the game, which is the energy buck. And like everything in the game, it's tied to reality. 100 energy bucks equals $1 billion of real life investment. And then finally, there's also an element of randomness and uncertainty in the game that comes from these random event cards, which your team has to overcome 1 or 2 every year. And these are mainly climate impacts, things like natural disasters, and then also social and political climate impacts. So I'm just gonna walk through one turn really quickly. So the team collects your annual budget, which you all work together to decide how to spend. Every player draws cards. You all discuss, you decide, you make a plan for the year, what you're gonna do with those cards. Each player can play up to 2 cards, and you go around in order. And then you experience your random event. If you roll a 1 to a 4, you only have to do 1. These are mainly unpleasant events since they're climate impacts. If it's a 5 or 6, you do 2. And then finally, if it's every 4 years, then you complete an election. And if you lose the election, your budget's cut in half. And then you move on to the next year. Very recently, we've made a beta version of the physical energetic, and it is available on through Steam. If you have questions about this, please email us. Right now, you have to download another piece of software to access it, but we're hoping to have it independent soon. And here are just some stills that kind of show how the game is played online. So now I'm going to pass it over to Theo, who will talk about how the game is used as a teaching tool.
Yeah, hey everyone, super happy to be here. I'll try to go quick because I feel like we may be going over our portion time. So yeah, as Richard talked about, as about January of last year, we started bringing the game outside of the office for the first time and really playing it with groups of young people to answer a Q&A question. We brought it to many groups of adults. Those were actually kind of the first players of the game were adults and many kind of energy scientist types and policy people. And so we were very sure about kind of, the dynamics of the game, that it was super accurate. We didn't know as much about, how engaging it would be, how fun it would be. And we actually realized really quickly and over again that people really loved it and really enjoyed it. And so this is a few pictures of us teaching the game. This is the event at Carnegie Mellon where we had, I think, 12 games going at once. It was a little overwhelming, but quite exciting. And through all these experiences, we've learned many things. First, it's really engaging, fun, and stimulating. As Archie showed, there's a lot going on in the game. From our experience, young people really love this and are kind of drawn to the challenge of trying to understand everything that's going on. And learning about climate change can be both scary, overwhelming, and also can get, as like the demonstration with the trillion versus a billion, it can be hard to kind of fathom this stuff. So I think there's enough here that people can really engage with it, but also without sacrificing kind of the reality of the science. It allows young people to become comfortable with critical technologies, concepts, and industries, which will define the future of New York City. As Tina talked about in the beginning with the CLCPA, there are billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of major energy infrastructure going to be built throughout New York over the next many decades. And beginning right now, many of these contracts have already been awarded. And so for young people thinking about where to kind of find a career, we really think that exposing them to these industries early on and in this type of engaging way can be really effective and quite powerful for them moving forward. It also provides concrete options to address climate change at a systemic level. Young people are so worried about climate, and increasingly so. We think that from our experience, me and Archie in college, we learned a lot about the challenges and the problems and the impacts that we're going to cause. We learned less about what it actually takes to solve it at a systemic level. Energetic begins to do that. And that finally, it empowers young people to come up with the solutions themselves, rather than just kind of telling them the various pathways to decarbonize New York City. It's kind of cool to watch them try to grapple with them themselves and to collaborate and to talk about it. And even in just playing one session of the game, by playing this collaborative board game and having to talk through all these decisions, you inherently become familiar with concepts that are really rare for the average, even adult to know about, even a policy, wonk to know about. And so it can be a real advantage. And so as we've also, begun to realize the educational potential that Energetic has, we've now started to design some educational materials to kind of supplement what Energetic shows you. So this is a graphic representation we made showing a turbine compared to the size of Manhattan skyline. So though the actual, turbines wouldn't actually go here, this is just to get a sense of the size. This is then, on the left, is Manhattan versus the size of one piece in Energetic. When you play one wind turbine piece, that's a gigawatt of wind. What it actually is 167 of these giant wind turbines you see right here. And so we've now, trying to, and then this is what it would look like if you had 16 gigawatts, which is what you need to power just New York City in renewable energy. This is what it would look like if you had 16 gigawatts of just offshore wind off the southern shore of Long Island. So we've made kind of materials like, we're beginning to make materials like this. And then we've also begun making this guide that explains everything in the game, where we're getting it from, what it means, and real life examples to make it more real and to help educators also. So, basic things like what is energy, what is power, why are we going towards 16 gigawatts, what's a power grid, to more technical things like what is pumped hydro. And then we have the same thing for each of the random events that are in the game, which cover, health impacts, political events, and extreme weather events as well. Our email and contact information are included in the bios that you all received. And please let us know if you have any questions. We'd love to talk more.